There, this is Jonathan Pratt from Military Family Services. We're going to get started because usually people schedule these in between other things going on in the office. So welcome to today's web exchange, which is regarding supporting families when there's a death in the community. Just before we get started, I did want to make a little note of caution that the topic being discussed today, as you can see on the whiteboard, is of a sensitive nature, and it may trigger feelings or emotions that participants may not be prepared for. So if that ever happens, then please feel free to contact Family Information Line, whose staff are available 24/7 at 1-800-866-4546. And they're always willing to chat at any time. And you can also reach them by email at fil@cafconnection.ca. So just before we get to the presentation, I wanted to make sure that everybody's okay with using the interactive elements of WebEx. I'll just make sure that there aren't some attendees lingering in the background here who I haven't made able to view the session. So first of all, to check your audio, if the audio is not working, just go to the top left of the screen and click on Communicate and your audio connection and check that out. If for some reason it doesn't seem to be working, feel free to call into the teleconference line that I've got open currently. Also, please be sure to mute your microphone. In order to do that, you just go to the right-hand side, the top right of the screen, and make sure that the participants section is blue, as I've shown right here. That's what it looks like. And then next to your name, you'll see a microphone icon, and when it turns red, it's muted, and when it turns white, it's unmuted. Using check marks is another way to be interactive in the session. So in order to make a check or an X, you just go to the little megaphone that looks like this on the bottom right or the middle right of your screen, and you have a few different options there. So can everyone just try that now? Just try clicking on the check mark or the X or whatever you like. Just make sure you know how to interact that way, just in case you don't want to turn on or off your mic. Perfect. That's great. Excellent. And also, of course, you saw that you can raise your hand. So you can click that on or off if you want to ask a question. Feel free to use the chat as well. You just have to go to the top right of your screen and make sure that the chat tab is blue. And that way that opens up your chat window and you can chat with anyone or everyone. Just to ask questions or to communicate there if for some reason your mic isn't working or if you prefer to keep the background noise to a minimum. So without further ado, let's pass it over to Nicole at Cold Lake.
Okay, hi everybody. Hi Jonathan, can you hear me?
Yep.
Do you want me on video or does it matter?
Well, it makes it a little bit more interactive if you're okay with it.
Yeah, that's fine. Okay, give me 1 second here. Can everybody see me?
Can't see you yet.
Just give me 1 second here. Sorry.
Mm-hmm.
How's this working?
And if it doesn't seem to be working, don't worry about it, Nicole.
Okay. I'm just trying to get to my main page here. Okay.
Yeah, no worries.
Well, it's working for me, but it doesn't seem to be working. I'm sorry about that. I can see myself.
No problem.
Okay, well, thank you, everybody, for joining the WebEx. Jonathan had asked if I wanted to participate in this, and I think that, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, Jonathan, but I think that this may have stemmed out of our last meeting in Cornwall, and it was kind of a spin-off conversation that we had been having just based on some pretty unfortunate experiences that we had in Cold Lake in 2016. So for anyone who's not aware, we're at a fighter Air Force base at Fort Wayne Cold Lake, so we're a fully operational tactical fighter and training base. We also host an air show every 2 years that we alternate with Bagotville. And as my time as a flow, I had encountered up until 2016 anticipated deaths in the community meaning people who were terminally ill, usually through the IPSC military community. I had also come across unfortunately, some deaths by suicide, as well as some motor vehicle accidents and other causes of death that I had to work on families from an individual case-by-case basis with. I'm not here to talk about that today. I think everybody probably has some unfortunate experience with that and expertise in that area, but what I am here to share with you today is about 2016 being 2 tragic cases where we had the entire community who was impacted by death in the form of 2 separate plane crashes that both ended in fatalities. Can everyone still hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you just fine.
Okay, my screen's going all wonky, so all I can see right now is just the actual document, but I'll just keep talking, and if you can't, just let me know.
Okay.
So the first crash happened in July of 2016 during our air show. So it was on day 2 of the air show. We had tens of thousands of people here from outside of community, inside of community, military, civilian, you name it, including media. And it ended in a fatality, and the crash occurred right on the runway. So anybody who was watching the air show could have potentially seen the crash. The MFRC was at the air show just in a booth. And everybody responded immediately with the crash response team in terms of the base. But we had to think on our feet pretty quickly in terms of how we were going to work with the base in their crash response and keeping everybody safe, but at the same time take the lead in supporting families and other community members through this process. We weren't perfect at it, and I'm going to be the first one to admit that we weren't perfect about it by a long shot, but we did what we could. So I'm here to talk about what we did do, and I'll tell you about what we didn't do that I think in retrospect we could have done better. We had to clear the area right away, so we didn't have an option about that. And one of the concerns was that we were selling these MFRC stuffed air bears. And I think at the time some people thought it's a good idea to give children the bears as they're walking out, but we decided not to because it would compromise the safety of clearing the space. So we didn't do that, unfortunately. But also there were reasons for that. What we did do is we remained open at the MFRC just off, we're still on the base, but we're away from the airspace, so that anybody who needed to come in could come in. At the same time, I came in and created the document that you have in front of you called Restoring a Sense of Safety, Tips for Parents and Professionals. And when I say I created, I mean that I took the information, but I took it with consent and I referenced it. And I had to do that because there was no time. And I also had to do that because we did not proactively plan for something like this to happen, or at least in the time that I've been here, we haven't. So that's part of the lessons learned. I tried to find a source that had the most concrete, comprehensive, evidence-based information we could for people to read at their own time at home, because what we were seeing, and this is with no disrespect to the base or the community, but what we were seeing in the day that followed was that we were getting a lot of phone calls from parents who were expecting that there were going to be maybe pathological issues with their children who experienced this. And one of the tones that we wanted to set was that this was a traumatic experience and that there is acute stress following something like this. So we wanted to give them some education and some psychoeducation on things that they could maybe expect, but also with the resources for connecting for help. And I'll tell you that although not perfect, this document, once it was shared on our Facebook page, was shared more than any other item that we've ever put up in history. And that's because it was shared across the province and maybe across the country, I don't know for sure. And it was shared beyond the military community. What I think and I hope that it did, based on the response rate, is that it gave parents and stakeholders and community members a sense of confidence that what was happening was normal, a normal response to an abnormal event. That there were ways of coping today and talking through it and talking to each other and within families and between friends. but also that it was also a normalized response to come and seek additional help. So that was our experience with the plane crash at the air show. The pilot who passed away in that plane crash was a civilian pilot. He toured air shows all the time. He didn't have direct correlations with the military community here, but he definitely did within the air show community. So just briefly to go over just the document, and everybody can read, and I'm sure they've seen it. We tried to include various age groups and developmental stages in terms of what might present for children and adolescents, but we also included a section for adults because I think that parents like to turn inwards towards their children and sometimes forget that they too could have been witness to this and affected by it. All of the references are cited at the end. I took the majority of this information came from the Center for the Study of Traumatic Stress, and the only reason that I pulled it from there is because it was a place where I was really invested at the time and I knew the information well and I could do it. I sent everybody a copy of the original document we had used. And you'll see that I didn't put the family information line, and that was a product of me rushing because I had to get it to our comms person, and then our comms person had to get it up so that people could access it. So in later versions of this, we would include other numbers. So helpful coping strategies was also something that we added. It was pretty soft in terms of the coping strategies. But we just wanted to give people something over a weekend that they could do. Are we looking at the progressive muscle relaxation for any particular reason, or?
No, I'm just pointing to various things that you're pointing
out. Okay, yeah. So it is a long document, but we were able to share it via PDF. We also emailed it across the base and to all of our stakeholders within community and to the outlying communities. So anybody that we thought could benefit in terms of an access point, that means the schools, it means family and social services centers, it meant the hospital, you name it. We kind of just did a community-wide blast out. And I will say that the turnout in terms of counseling follow-up after that initial crash was, that first crash was very minimal and very surprising. But the document was talked about quite a bit and I think appreciated and served its function. So I hope that the access to services was minimal because people, like we see with kind of the natural progression with acute stress, naturally came back to baseline. That's my hope. My hope is that over the sense that they just didn't want to come, but I've spoken to mental health in town as well, and they said there was minimal turnout for that as well. So any questions about the first incident?
Again, feel free to put your questions in the chat or unmute your microphone.
Okay. So again, and as I said at the beginning, like I didn't think that I would use this time to speak about anticipated loss in the military community. I think that that's a strong point in terms of what we're already doing, although I'd love to hear anything that anybody has to add about this. But for us, it was really about incidents that impacted a large population of people, and I'm one here, so I tried to just make one resource that could say enough and add some content and get it, or context and get it out there. The second crash that we had in 2016 was in November. I'm sure that people have heard about it, but if not, it was one of our own pilots from 401 Squadron here. His name was Captain Thomas McQueen. That crash happened on our range, which is not right next to the base, but a couple kilometers away, I guess, airplane-wise. You couldn't see it. Nobody witnessed it except for the other pilot that he was flying with. But that one was, again, something that affected our entire community. Cold Lake is very small. The fighter force is also very small and kind of spans across the country. And it's tight-knit, like I'm sure a lot of other military communities are. Again, we used a version of this document, but we limited it to our smaller community, and we had tailored resources for specific populations. So again, that was all done on the fly, but some of the things that were interesting to me, and I'm not going to go into specifics for confidentiality reasons, but the broader aspect that was interesting to me is that we often think about who is involved on paper, right? So the designated assistant, the Padre, the MFRC family liaison officer, etc. One of the things that I learned from that process is that we really could have done a better job, and there was a lesson learned in how those roles would fit together in the event of an incident. And I think some very productive conversations and planning came afterwards out of that, although I think everybody did the best they could in that situation. So I guess one of the lessons that I would say moving forward from this is that if you're working on a base, the potential is always there that something catastrophic is going to happen, and it's going to impact the entire base, and you guys have probably been through it before. And if you don't have some kind of easily accessible document that's like this, or your version of this, or something better than this, I would highly recommend that you don't wait for when, and that you make it a priority to try to develop in advance. Feel free to use this one if you like it, or parts of it. Because it's time pressure, and if you're in a flow role or any other role, the ED role even for that matter, you're going to be pulled probably in 12 different directions, and it's just one more thing off your plate if you can have something like this accessible, and that your marketing and communications person also has access to it once you've finalized it. That would be my big takeaway. My second takeaway would be to have a proactive conversation with the care providers and stakeholders on your base and your community about what you guys would do if there was a response like this, and talk specifically about roles, process, and then specific populations, so resources and immediate assistance for children versus adults, and communication and how that's going to be done. These are two really unfortunate and in some senses devastating events for our community, 2 in 1 year. And not to find a silver lining in all this, but if I would highlight any positive, it is that we are better prepared if it ever were to happen again. So those are my big 2 takeaways. I would welcome any feedback or questions or any experience anybody else has.
That's excellent. Thanks, Nicole. I actually have a question for you while we're just waiting for other questions as well. What would be among your top 3 suggestions? I'm assuming that this resource would be one of them. What would be among your top 3 suggestions that really seem to help families at the time when you have a situation like this?
I can say with respect to the second crash that we had that kind of was closer to home in terms of community, that one of my suggestions also is that we don't have to pathologize people's responses to things like this. It's not always about one-on-one behind closed doors counseling, although that's always the option, but we actually got a greater response from groups wanting to meet. So for example, a wives group wanted to meet because they were very close to somebody who was involved with a pilot who passed away. That's absolutely okay, but they wanted me as a facilitator. That's absolutely okay too, and it was more beneficial. People heal in groups when they experience trauma in groups, if that makes sense. So just to have that capacity and availability within your center, and that the center understands that sometimes that needs to take priority. So like we commandeered our deployment center as a meeting space for people privately, and that was okay because operationally that's what our priority was. The second takeaway that I would have is to, and this kind of gets into therapeutic work, so I'll be careful here because I don't really know everybody who I'm talking to, but my experience is that when you're working with populations like this, there's really no advice you can give them, you know. It's mostly about having a sacred space for them to be with you and express how they are feeling that's free of judgment. And sometimes that can be very hard because within a military community, when we're dealing with death, so much of it through the DA process is so structured in some ways that we can tend to forget about the fact that grief response is not structured. I guess that's more of a rant than a suggestion. My third suggestion is self-care, and I know we always talk about that, but I would say from my own experience being one of one through 2016, it was incredibly important for me to maintain resiliency and my own health. Those would be my 3 takeaways.
That's excellent. And just one other question that I had for you. When you talked about the importance of preparing the groundwork by being proactive in your conversation with people in the community, with the potential resources like the Padres and the various groups on the base or wing that you'd be using, were there particular tips that you could provide that you've learned through that process of reaching out to resources that you found really useful to start and cement those relationships?
Well, for anybody, I don't know how it is base by base, but we're fairly close to begin with. It's just that we had never really had a candid meeting that said, if something like this happens, what are we going to do? Because I don't think anybody really likes to think about it or expected it. But we should have, was the lesson learned. And so helping professionals meetings can be important. If you are in a position where you're able to meet with the CEOs of units or the senior NCMs of units, that's important as well. I think that when there's a crisis like this, everybody's scrambling because it's not so clean and tidy. And there's a lot of questioning about whose role, or at least there was in our response, whose role is it to do what, and how much is falling on the Padre versus the family liaison officer. And my role in what we did was I just said, I will do and be where you need me to be and what you need me to do, because I'm certainly not taking the lead on this. But talking it through helps so that when it happens, you're better prepared for it. I would just have a frank conversation with the stakeholders you're working with on base, because it's part of our positions, right? And so competency in our position is to make sure that we know what we're doing when we're expected to do it.
Great. It looks like we have a question from Dean as well.
Great. Could you read it out to me, please? Because for some reason I'm just stuck on the document.
Well, actually, this is Dean.
Hi.
Hi. I just unmuted my mic. My question is, what can you say to us about the individual families that suffered the loss, like, and how they were treated? And like, I'm a former executive director of the MFRC, and my thing is, like, who makes contact with the family? How do you decide the privacy and confidentiality, or balance confidentiality, privacy of a family, and the need and want to help and support a family?
Okay.
How do you?
That's a great question. And so just bear with me while I babble a little bit, because I do want to respect the privacy of the families that went through this. But on our base, how it works, and I'm pretty sure that CAF-wide, how it works is this. When there is a death from a military member, the chain of command, usually in conjunction with the Padres, are responsible for notifying next of kin. So that's a hard and fast rule here, and I expect everywhere. In terms of that, we know that notification of next of kin falls under that. The next way that I kind of reached out to families, because again, I think families are bombarded during the onset of this, and so you also don't want to be another person that's taking up their time when they're going through this crisis. So what I did is we tried to streamline all of the contacts in a very simple way, so that the one point of contact for the family, they're usually two, so the designated assistant or the commanding officer and the Padre, very concretely knew whose role was what and how the families could contact them and when even to introduce that to the family. So in this instance, I was introduced right away, and that was fine. And I mean right away. But the biggest part of that is that I would never contact families directly unless the DA or the CO or the Padre had already explained my role and they had expressed that they wanted me to contact them. Does that answer your question, Dean?
Yes, thank you. That's exactly what I wanted to hear. Thank you.
Okay.
Are there any questions from anyone else? We definitely don't need to push it all the way to the half hour if there are no other questions. And please do feel free to reach out to either myself or Nicole. That's why I always put the presenter's contact info there if there are any other questions that you have after the fact, because a lot of the time this is the start of a conversation. One thing I wanted to draw your attention to was I mentioned in the earlier on when I sent out the save the date notice that Petawawa would be joining us. Due to a scheduling difficulty, they weren't able to join us today, but they did send us some great resources. I put them on here, but I will also be uploading them to the website right underneath the YouTube link for the recording of this session. So, so I just wanted to draw your attention to those things as well. And I'm just going to check the chat and make sure I haven't missed any questions that might have come up. Okay, so it looks like we're good. I don't see any other questions or any other hands up. Right now, my computer is doing funny things as well. So, so thank you so much, Nicole, and thanks for everyone turning out today. Again, don't hesitate to contact us if there are other questions in the meantime, and hopefully this can be the beginning of some collaborative work together on how to deal with these kinds of difficult situations. So thank you very much for showing up today, and we'll see you at the next Web Exchange. Nicole, if you could just stay on the line for a minute afterwards, that would be great.
Thank you.